The girl who returned from the grave, a confession beneath the moonlight. No one knew why the rain fell at that very moment. Under the scorching sky of a desert city, where the domes of ancient mosques blazed like blood-red suns, a proud young woman walked across golden stone tiles as if treading upon the fates of those beneath her. Her name was Nourjahan, the light of the world. A name so beautiful it almost begged for tragedy. But that name had become a curse ever since she learned how to twist that light into a sword of pride. Born into silk and privilege, the only daughter of a powerful merchant, she was worshipped like a goddess. Nothing she wanted was out of reach. No one could refuse her. There were no boundaries, except for the one she never recognized, the limit of her own soul. Her father, Sheikh Abdul Rahman, built her a palace surrounded by fruit trees from every region of the land. Her mother, gentle but blind, filled her daughter's lips with kisses and the servants' ears with orders barked in her name. And so, Nourjahan grew, like a rose fed on arrogance, watered with rage, and blooming from the tears of the weak. That day, she went to the market again. Dressed in ivory robes trimmed with silver, a veil lightly draped over her head, she walked among her entourage like the queen of all gazes, hungry, resentful, or both. An old man, eyes clouded by blindness, happened to turn his face toward her. That was all. Just one fleeting moment, and Nourjahan erupted with fury. She felt seen, judged, disrespected. She was too beautiful, too revered to be looked upon so casually. Any gaze that didn't bow, in her eyes, was an insult. "Bring him to me," she commanded. The guards obeyed without a word. "You dared to look at me? Do you not know who I am?" The old man bowed his head, trembling, his voice dry and hoarse. "My child. I am blind. I cannot see anyone at all. Just one word, my child. Just one gentle voice in the middle of a noisy street." But to Nourjahan, it was a slap to her pride. "Teach him a lesson," she said coldly. "Let him learn never to look toward a light he does not deserve." The whips cracked. The fists flew. The groans of pain echoed. No one in the crowd dared to intervene, not even when a young man dashed forward, cradling the bloodied body of the old man, crying, "This is my father. What are you doing?" That young man's name was Umar. A simple name for a simple man. But that day, by the side of a nearly dead father, a vow was born, silent as wind, sharp as a blade. Umar's father whispered through bloodied lips, "Don't do anything foolish, she is light." Umar lowered his head. "No, father, she is fire." That night, while the city slumbered under oil lamps, Umar did not sleep. He sat by his father in silence. Then, without a word, he left, heading toward her palace. Not to kill. Not for revenge. He had learned another art, the art of silence, of breath, of sorcery, and of karma. If you're still watching this video and feel outraged by Nourjahan's arrogance, please comment the number 5 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend hitting the subscribe button and the bell. Your support helps us continue making content that informs and inspires. That night, Nourjahan lounged on an ebony chair by her white-curtained window, slowly twirling a crystal orb brought from the west. She was daydreaming, of ceremonies, banquets, or perhaps being crowned a princess by some distant king. And Umar was there. In the shadows. Behind the curtains. Silent. Then, it happened. A snake, small, unexpected, slithered up and bit her ankle. She screamed. She trembled. But no one came in time. Umar stepped forward, eyes cold as stone. He did nothing. Said nothing. He merely watched as the color drained from her porcelain skin, the poison, no ordinary venom, spreading slowly. It was a cursed toxin, known only to those trained in the arts between life, death, karma, and liberation. When she fell silent, no breath, no motion, Umar turned and walked away. No hatred. No satisfaction. Only the beginning of a lesson. The next morning, the city sky was no longer blue. A film of gray dust hung over the towers. In the silent garden of the merchant's mansion, the sound of sobs broke into pieces. Sheikh Abdul Rahman collapsed beside his daughter's bed. Her body, still as jade, pale as ivory. The color gone from her lips. No wound. No poison. No sign of a killer. Only a silence so deep, it felt like she had willingly withdrawn from life. Her mother sat frozen, clutching the comb her daughter used that very morning. No one, guards, maids, not even the old servant, spoke. The death of Nourjahan, the family's light, cast the entire house into a bottomless void. The following day, the funeral procession moved slowly down a white stone path toward the royal cemetery, a place for the noble and elite. Her sandalwood coffin, carved with symbols of prosperity and divine favor, was buried beneath an ancient tamarind tree. Sheikh Abdul Rahman knelt before the grave, tears pouring into the dirt, as if trying to water his daughter's soul with the last drops of a father's love. He did not know that grave would open tonight. At midnight. When the last prayer faded and the city fell into sleep, a shadow stepped into the cemetery. No lantern. No torch. Only the lone moonlight through leaves, falling upon the figure burdened by karma. It was Umar. No one saw him dig. No one heard a shovel. Because he didn't use one. It was done through spells, karma's invocation, and the invisible bond between two incomplete souls. A gust of wind howled. The coffin creaked open. No stench. No worms. Only a body still soft, eyelids gently closed, lips still pink. Nourjahan looked as if asleep. Umar lifted her from the grave and walked through the cemetery like a dream. No spirits blocked the way. In fact, ghostly figures stood along the path, heads bowed, not out of respect, but as witnesses of her awakening. He took her to a cave deep in the eastern mountains, where he once learned the arts of healing, and faced the darkness after his mother's death and father's fading life. No candles. No mirrors. No silk nor song. Only stone, moss, and the terrifying silence of truth. He laid her on a flat rock. Moonlight pierced through a gap above, like a halo. He sat beside her, eyes closed, chanting a mantra, one that purifies the soul of pride. Then, Nourjahan stirred. Her eyelids fluttered. Her head shifted. A faint moan, like wind through stone. And she opened her eyes. It was not a fairy tale awakening of light. It was confusion. Panic. Screams. Where am I? Who are you? She shouted, eyes wild. Who kidnapped me? Mother? Father? Umar stepped forward gently. You were not kidnapped. You were brought back from death. Who are you? She shrieked. What do you want? He looked into her once enchanting eyes, now chaotic, lost. I am Umar, he said slowly, the son of the man you had beaten in the marketplace. The cave turned cold. Nourjahan froze. Her body trembled. But she snapped back. So what? You poisoned me. Umar nodded. Not poison. An ancient spell. One that halts the heart without harming the body. You died, as the world sees it. And now, you live again, at the price of karma. She smirked, her familiar haughty grin returning. You think you can keep me here? My father will find me. You'll beg for your life. Umar didn't flinch. He simply turned away and said, This is not a prison. This is a mirror. And when you dare to look into it, you will see yourself, not with powder and paint, but with every sin you've ever sown. If you're still watching and praying for the return of a lost soul, please comment the number 6 below to let me know you're here. If you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend you do and turn on the bell. Your support helps us continue to create meaningful content. That first night after resurrection, Nourjahan could not sleep. Not out of fear, but because she no longer knew who she was. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the grave, herself in white silk, in darkness, in silence so loud it deafened. When her eyes opened, there was stone. Cold. And the quiet chanting of Umar, the man she once dismissed as street dust. Each morning, Umar brought her a bowl of brown rice porridge, a few dried dates, and a flask of water. No meat. No honey. No jasmine milk tea she once adored. Food for purification, Umar said. So you can finally see what you've never seen. Furious, she threw the porridge, shattered the flask against the stone. You think this will change me? I am Nourjahan. This city bowed at my feet. I get what I want. And you are nothing. Umar simply smiled faintly. He gathered the broken shards quietly, and left without another word. When darkness fell again and the cave curled into one echoing breath, Nourjahan began to tremble. Not from cold, but from the realization that she had nothing left, except her name. No mirror. No makeup. No servant to scold. Only stone. And her own shadow, reflected by moonlight through the rock wall's gap. She looked at it, and for the first time, saw a small, proud girl, terrified of her own breathing. The next morning, Umar returned. She said nothing. She simply accepted the porridge, and ate. It was bland. But as she swallowed, warmth filled her chest, something even golden feasts had never given. What do you want from me? She asked. Her voice was no longer prideful. It was searching. Nothing, Umar replied. I don't want your tears. I don't want your apology. I only want, for you to see. To see yourself. The next day, Umar brought an old, tarnished bronze mirror and set it before her. This is the mirror of memory, he said. When you look into it, you won't see your face, you'll see the moments where you caused others pain. Nourjahan sneered. A child's trick. But when she glanced into the mirror, a wave of dizziness struck her. In the mirror, she saw a young maid slapped during dinner, just for bringing the wrong silver spoon. She saw a fruit boy chased and beaten by her guards for daring to smile as she passed by. She saw Umar's father, blind and collapsed on the ground, whispering, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. She jumped to her feet and screamed. Stop. Stop. I don't want to see anymore. Umar replied calmly. No one is forcing you to look. But this is what you left behind on earth. Death doesn't erase karma. Only recognition, acceptance, and transcendence can. That night, Nourjahan didn't eat. She sat silently before the small fire Umar had left. For the first time, she didn't think of gowns, or revenge, or her parents. She thought of faces. Eyes swollen with tears. Voices trembling with pleas for mercy. And Umar's eyes, not angry, not scornful, just the eyes of someone once a victim, who chose forgiveness over punishment. That night, Nourjahan cried. Not the kind of tears that beg for forgiveness or pity, but the tears of someone seeing herself, truly, for the first time. Through her sobs, she whispered, "I don't want to be that person. I never wanted to." And deep within her consciousness, a small lotus began to bloom. Since the night the mirror of memory spoke, Nourjahan was no longer the girl who walked with her head high as if the world existed only to bow. She began to lower her head. Not to Umar. Not to the fire or the plain brown rice porridge. But to her own past. Each day, Umar brought her a small scroll, nothing written but a question. Do you remember the name of the first servant you cast out? When was the last time you looked your father in the eyes without asking for something? Have you ever hugged your mother, not to show off a new dress, but simply to love her? At first, Nourjahan didn't answer. She bit her lip, crumpled the paper. But day by day, the questions needed no response, for silence was the most haunting answer of all. One morning, as sunlight trickled into the cave, Nourjahan sat quietly across from Umar. "What more do you want from me?" she asked, her voice lower than usual. Umar didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled out a dried lotus seed and placed it in her palm. "Plant this." She blinked. "Here? In stone?" "Yes," he replied, his gaze steady. "Just like you, it was once a seed fallen into hard ground. But with patience, it will grow. Not to bloom for others to admire, but to prove that even stone can crack, when touched by compassion." Nourjahan let out a faint laugh. A sorrowful sound. Not because the words were silly, but because they were true. She gathered some dry soil from the cave, dug a shallow hole in the sunniest corner, and buried the seed. Not expecting it to sprout. Not expecting it to bloom. But simply, to try believing in something beyond herself. From that day, she began to tidy the place. Sweeping the old rug. Folding her blanket. Lighting her own fire when the night came. Umar didn't say a word. Didn't instruct her. But he saw. And he understood. A soul was learning humility, without needing an audience. One afternoon, Nourjahan told Umar, "Did you know, my father once said I was the first light after 10 long winters." "I know," Umar replied. "But light, when placed in the wrong place, can blind." She nodded. And whispered, so soft it was barely audible, "I blinded too many." That night, Nourjahan dreamed. In the dream, she was walking down the white stone road her father once led her on as a child. Everything was small. Even her. Her father held her hand, saying nothing. Her mother followed behind, carrying a bouquet of jasmine. A beggar passed by. The little Nourjahan took a sweet bun from her father's hand, ran over, and placed it in the beggar's palm, smiling innocently. That smile, her grown self had long forgotten. But now, she saw it again. When she awoke, tears still lingered at the corners of her eyes. Not because the dream was beautiful, but because she understood. There had once been a Nourjahan who knew how to love. And life, through silk, pride, and power, had stripped it away, piece by piece. That morning, Nurjahan stood and walked out of the cave, for the first time in many months. She looked at the sky. It wasn't blinding anymore. It didn't feel like it existed for her alone. It was simply light. And for the first time, she didn't feel it belonged to her. On the 49th night since being brought back from the grave, Nurjahan no longer counted days. She no longer screamed. No longer shattered things. No longer curled up in fear. She had learned to breathe like someone truly alive. And sometimes, she quietly arranged wildflowers in the small vases Umar left behind. Not for ceremony. Not for display. But from a gratitude that had no name yet. That night, Umar sat by the fire, back against the stone wall, watching the flame flicker in silence. Nurjahan sat across from him, hands gently folded. She looked at him and asked, "My father, is he still alive?" Umar nodded slowly. "Yes. But he's not the man you remember." "Because of me?" she asked quietly. "Because he buried his daughter with his own hands. And every morning, he brings flowers to a grave where no one lies anymore." The cave fell silent. Then, Nurjahan wept. No blame. No bitterness. Just tears, of a daughter who, for the first time, understood her father's heart. The next morning, she spoke. "Umar, take me back. Not to return as a princess, but to tell my parents that their daughter died long ago. And the one who returns today, in the same body, is someone else. Someone who only wishes to bow her head." If you're still watching this video and wish to see a sanctified Nurjahan, please comment the number 9 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I highly recommend you click subscribe and turn on the bell. Your support helps us continue to create content that informs and inspires. Umar didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment. Nurjahan's eyes no longer carried the glint of arrogance. No trace of pride. Only a strange, beautiful sorrow, like a lotus blooming in the dark. "All right," Umar finally said. "But before you leave the cave, there is one thing to do." He led her to the mountain's peak. There, the wind blew fiercely, but it wasn't cold. The rocky earth was barren, untouched. In the center was a symbolic grave Umar had built himself. A place where he had buried the scrolls, the pieces of silk soaked in Nurjahan's tears. "This," he said, "is where you'll bury your past." Nurjahan stepped forward. No hesitation. She removed the jade bracelet, the only thing she had kept since being taken away. Once a symbol of power, now, a token of remorse. She placed it in the soil. And with her own hands, covered it, with her heart. When it was done, she rose and turned to Umar. "Thank you, not for forgiving me, but for not punishing me." Umar bowed slightly. "I did nothing. You saved yourself." Then they descended the mountain. No horse. No carriage. Just a girl in a plain white robe, barefoot, walking through grass and streams. As if for the first time, she moved without needing anyone to bow in her presence. The day she returned, the whole city seemed to hold its breath. The gatekeeper was the first to see her, and nearly fainted, thinking he'd seen a ghost. The girl he had personally watched be carried to the royal graveyard now stood before him, calm, as if death had never come. Word spread like wind. Her father, Sheikh Abdul Rahman, lay in his room. Beard turned white, eyes sunken from years of grief. When someone shouted from outside, She has returned. The lady has come back. He sat upright, as if time had peeled away years from his bones. He rushed from his room. And when he saw Nourjahan standing at the stone steps, holding her robe, head bowed, he collapsed to his knees. "My daughter, is it truly you?" His voice cracked, like a vessel overflowing with tears. Nourjahan rushed to him, wrapped him in her arms, sobbing, "Father, forgive me. I died long ago. The one standing before you today is not a princess, not a lady. Just a daughter who's too late in learning what a father's love means." Her mother burst from the house, screamed, then embraced them both, crying uncontrollably. The entire house, in that moment, became a place of resurrection. Not because their daughter had returned, but because, for the first time, they had truly met the soul they once lost. After the tearful reunion, Nourjahan was taken back to her old room, where everything had remained untouched since the day she left. White silk sheets. A window that opened to the lotus pond. Sheer curtains catching the afternoon sun, casting shadows where she once stood with a mirror in hand. But she was no longer the girl who had walked into that room. And the room, though unchanged, was no longer a throne of pride. In the days that followed, Nourjahan lived quietly in the estate. She didn't go out. Didn't receive guests. She spent her time with her parents, learning, for the first time, to listen instead of speak. She brushed her mother's hair, read beside her father every evening, and each night, gazed at the sky, where the moon no longer reflected her vanity, but had become an eternal mirror for a soul still growing. One morning, beneath a pale sunrise, she approached her father, who had grown thin from the weight of sorrow. She knelt beside him, held his hand. "Father, I want to tell you a story about a boy I once hurt, who, instead of seeking revenge, taught me what it truly means to live." The story stretched from morning till midday. Her father, Sheikh Abdul Rahman, said nothing. But with every memory of the cave, the mirror of memory, the name Umar spoken like a flame in darkness. He held her hand tighter. When she finished, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "My daughter, you've finally become the person I always wished you'd be. Not a princess, but someone who knows gratitude. So let me ask you, would you welcome Umar into our family? Not just as the one who saved you, but as a son-in-law?" Nourjahan looked up at her father. For the first time, her eyes sparkled not with anger or pride, but with the fragile hope that love could begin in guilt, and grow through compassion. She nodded. Slowly. Firmly. "I want to be with Umar. Not to be loved, but to have the chance to love him back, with the new soul I've learned to become." The very next day, Sheikh sent a delegation with offerings to invite Umar to the estate. They walked through the streets. But unlike before, there was no display, no soldiers, no golden carriage. Just humble people, seeking a solitary carpenter who lived on the edge of the city, beside a garden he had planted with his own hands. Umar saw the procession and paused slightly. When they told him Sheikh wished to see him, he said nothing. Just furrowed his brow. He had once believed, Nourjahan must have told the truth. And that truth would enrage her father. But what he hadn't expected was that people could grow through forgiveness. When Umar stepped into the estate, Nourjahan was waiting at the gate. She wore a plain robe. No jewelry. No painted lips. but the light radiating from her was no longer the light of vanity. It was the light of someone who had walked through the longest night of her life and come out whole. Her father stepped forward and looked at Umar. No anger, no coldness, only a gaze, shaped by enough suffering to realize that some debts are better repaid with gratitude, not hatred. He embraced Umar. No words of thanks were needed. Just a hug. A few days later, the wedding was held, simple and warm. No fireworks. No orchestra. Only the scent of incense, the glow of oil lamps, and whispered prayers. And two people, one who had once been arrogant to the point of ruin, and one who had once burned with vengeance, now stood together, like two fallen leaves drifting on the same river, born of different springs, yet flowing toward the same shore. People often believe, when the wedding ends, love enters its fairy tale chapter. But for Nourjahan and Umar, it was merely the doorway to a brand new trial. No dragons. No monsters. Only old wounds still unhealed, and truths that had never fully been spoken. After the wedding, they didn't live in the palace. It was Nourjahan's request. If I return there, she said, people will bow to me as the wife of a hero. But I don't want admiration. I want to live as a normal person. To learn how to be human again. And so, Umar prepared a small house for her beside his carpentry workshop. It was rustic. It smelled of dry pine, echoed with the sound of sawing each morning, and had stray cats wandering under the bed. No jasmine. No silk. But Nourjahan no longer needed them. What she needed was to wipe the table with her own hands, to light the fire, to steep tea, and know that her hands were no longer made to command, but to care. On the first day, she accidentally broke a ceramic jar that Umar had spent a week firing. Umar said nothing. Nourjahan lowered her head and picked up each shard. That night, she quietly glued the jar back together with pine resin, not beautiful, not perfect, but when she handed it to Umar, she said, just like me. Once shattered, and now being pieced back together, slowly. It may never be what it once was, but it will be one of a kind. Umar didn't speak, but he placed the jar on the altar, beside a photo of his mother and the old prayer scroll of his father. In his silence, he had accepted that this love was truly beginning to bloom. But not every day was peaceful. One day, Nourjahan snapped at a neighbor for bringing the wrong sack of rice. Her voice rose, anger resurfacing like an old ghost. The neighbor recoiled, frightened. Umar stood at the doorway. Not angry. Not disappointed. Just sad. That night, Nourjahan sat alone. She scolded herself. No one said anything, but the old mirror of memory from the cave returned to her mind, showing her a face twisted by ego. The next morning, she went to the neighbor's house, bowed deeply, and smiled gently. I used to be someone who made people afraid. But now, I'm learning to become someone they can trust. If you forgive me, I'll carry that kindness with me for the rest of my life. The woman stood stunned. Then, smiled. From that day forward, the neighbors began to see Nourjahan differently. No longer as the lady who rose from the grave, but as the new girl, who lives in a small house, brews great tea, and tells sad folk tales when the moon is full. One evening, with the full moon hanging high, Umar was sawing wood while Nourjahan washed rice in a stone basin. She looked up and whispered, Umar, if someday I fall weak again, if the ghosts of my past return, Will you still hold my hand? Umar didn't turn. He simply placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, gave it a soft squeeze, and said, I don't need a perfect wife. I just need someone brave enough to say, I was wrong, and still choose to keep going. To Nourjahan, that answer meant more than love. It was forgiveness, alive and breathing. Not a memory. Not a hollow promise. But something real, in each breath, in each glance. In each bowl of rice with soy sauce they shared at sunset. On a September afternoon, when the sun had softened and the wind carried the scent of dry grain from distant fields. Nourjahan was stitching a handkerchief, her first one in years. Each thread, carefully sewn. As if she were reweaving her life with the smallest, quietest strands of silk. Umar was mending the roof. The hammer struck in rhythm against the sky. Suddenly, from the old wooden gate, a voice called out. Not loud, not soft, but enough to make her hands freeze. Excuse me, is this the home of Lady Nourjahan? Lady. It had been so long since anyone had called her that. And this time, the name didn't stir pride. It weighed down her heart. She rose and stepped outside. The woman before her was in her 30s, small-framed, clothed in plain brown fabric, holding a bundle of country sweets. Her eyes trembled with grief, resentment, and tenderness. As if standing before a scar that had never fully healed. Nourjahan recognized her instantly. It was Rukhsar, the maid she had once slapped in the parlor. Simply for bringing the wrong ivory comb. That slap hadn't just knocked Rukhsar down. It had cost her her job, her dignity, and forced her to leave the city in silence. Nourjahan didn't know what to say. All the lessons, all the remorse in the cave, suddenly felt small beneath Rukhsar's gaze. She bowed her head, softly, like a passing breeze. I don't think I deserve your visit. But since you're here, may I invite you in? Not to explain, but to truly bow. Rukhsar said nothing. She simply stepped inside slowly and placed the sweets on the table. Nourjahan poured tea, her hands trembling ever so slightly. For the first time in her life, she trembled before someone who had once been her servant. Not from fear, but from shame. Have you been well? Nourjahan asked softly. Rukhsar remained silent for a long while, then answered. I once swore that if I ever saw you again, I would spit in your face. But today, when I saw you mending clothes, your hands dusted with flour, I found nothing left to spit. Only a woman who, like me, is learning how to live again. Nourjahan bit her lip, tears welling up. Back then, I was awful. I thought I was strong. But I was only a furious child with too much power. I don't expect your forgiveness. I just want you to know. I've never forgotten that slap, not for a single day. Rukhsar let out a quiet sigh. She poured more tea, then looked Nourjahan straight in the eye. No one lives forever in their mistakes. But not everyone dares to name those mistakes in front of the ones they hurt. Today, I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I want peace for myself. Those words, like a breeze, flung open a long locked door inside Nourjahan. No need for thank yous. No need for weeping embraces. Just a look, between two women who were once victim and perpetrator. Now sitting beside one another like two friends. Both learning to live again with the wounds they've carried. That evening, Nourjahan told Umar everything. He sat beside her, quietly listening. You know, Umar said. Forgiving yourself is the hardest part. But you're doing it, not with words, but with actions. And because of that, I only want to keep holding your hand. Until the end of this life. Nourjahan rested her head on his shoulder. In the darkness of their small home, no throne, no chandeliers. Just two people who once collided in fury. Now learning to love through forgiveness. A single tear fell onto the pillow. But it wasn't from regret. It was from a soul that had finally learned what freedom feels like. On a crisp autumn morning, Umar paused in the middle of shaping wood. He looked toward the stream behind the house, where Nourjahan was washing clothes. The breeze tousled her hair gently, but her eyes held a peace that stunned him. I want to take you back, he said. Back. She looked up. Umar nodded. To your grave. To where it all truly began. That morning, they said little. Nourjahan packed a small basket. A bouquet of white flowers. An old silk scarf she'd once forgotten in a trunk. And a handwritten note. To Nourjahan, the girl I once was. Thank you for dying, so I could live. They set off with only a small horse and a flask of water. The road to the cemetery wasn't long, but it felt heavy. Not because of memories. But because this time, she knew she was going to say goodbye, for real. The graveyard lay beneath ancient tamarind trees. Sunlight flickering through the leaves like the eyes of spirits watching each step. Her grave was still there, broken, like a hollow skeleton. But Umar had rebuilt a small stone marker. Simple. Etched only with, here once lay a girl who bore her name, but forgot her soul. Nourjahan stood still for a long time. No one cried. No prayers were spoken. Only the breath of the earth, and the wind sliding through stone. She knelt down, placed the bouquet on the grave. Then gently laid the silk scarf across the stone, a final farewell. I used to hate this place, she whispered. Because it reminded me of death. But now I understand. Sometimes we must die, to truly learn how to live. Umar stood behind her, silent. He knew, this woman no longer needed a guide. She was standing on her own. The feet of a soul, resurrected. Nourjahan lit the note. The inked words curled in flame, then vanished into smoke. A wisp of ash rose and spiraled into sunlight. To Nourjahan, the girl I used to be, she whispered once more. Thank you, for falling. Because of you, someone else was given the chance to rise. She turned away without looking back. Not from indifference. But because the one who once lay there had truly been set free. They walked home in silence the rest of that afternoon. No words were needed. The air felt washed clean. Umar gently squeezed her hand. Welcome home. Nourjahan smiled. But this time, it wasn't for the world. It was for herself. That night, as she lay down on the old wooden bed, the wind sang gently through the window. And for the first time since returning from the grave, Nourjahan slept deeply. No dreams. No nightmares. No regret. Only peace. 1 month after returning from the graveyard, Nourjahan sat in their small home. At the wooden table Umar had built for her when they married. Before her lay a piece of paper, a bamboo pen, and a morning quiet enough to touch the soul. Today, she told Umar as he stepped out to the garden. I'm writing my final letter. It's not meant for anyone. Just for a soul that slept too long. She lowered her head, the pen trembling slightly. But each word appeared clearly, as if her heart was guiding her hand. To Nurjahan, the girl I once was. I write to you, not to scold you, not to blame you. I write to say farewell. You once believed that power was your crown, that beauty was your sword, and that the world was made to bow beneath your feet. You slapped a mate over an ivory comb. You had a hungry boy beaten for laughing at the wrong time. You shoved a blind old man to the ground, simply because their gazes did not please you. You lived in the light. But that very light burned away the humanity within you, day by day, hour by hour. And then, you died. Not because of a snake. Not because of sorcery. You died because the weight of your karma, heavy as stone, dragged your soul down. But, from that grave, you began to learn how to breathe again. You cried, not out of fear, but because you finally saw your real face. You bowed, not before gods, but before yourself. You forgave, not for peace, but so others could find it. You learned to smile when the rice spilled over in the pot. To fetch water for your husband before dawn. To stay silent when wrongly scolded, and realize it wasn't humiliation, but liberation. I don't write this letter to reopen the past. I write to close it. From this day forward, Nurjahan, the name that once made people tremble, will be only a trace. And the one holding this pen now is a wife, a daughter, a friend, and above all, a soul who has been given a second chance. If someone, anyone, has ever been like you, arrogant, hurtful, tell them this story. Not to frighten them, but to help them believe. Maybe you were buried once, but not to die. Only to bloom. Signed, someone who once was darkness, and now learns to be a little flame. Nurjahan. Nurjahan set the pen down. Outside, Umar called in from the garden. Darling. The lotus in the pond behind the house just bloomed. The one you planted months ago. She smiled, but didn't rush out. Instead, she folded the letter with care, placed it in a small wooden box, and tucked it on the shelf beside the oil lamp, the one that burned every night. It would be her final scripture of repentance, and the very first scripture of her rebirth. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share one thing this story taught you, and how you'll carry that into your life. Your words matter. Reading your reflections brings us strength and inspiration. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue crafting stories that uplift, inspire, and heal. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.